Thank you all very much for coming. It's our great honor to have Steve Hadley, who is National Security Advisor for President George W. Bush. And we had Sandy Berger, but Sandy's a little bit under the weather. And on the theory that all former National Security Advisors are fungible and look alike, we have General Jim Jones. Actually, I don't think anybody's ever confused you on the street for Sandy Berger, right? And we always have a backup National Security Advisor at all of our meetings. So General Scowcroft, who is co-chairman of the Aspen Strategy Group, President George H.W. Bush's National Security Advisor. And I really think not since Henry Kissinger dined alone has there been such a stellar constellation of former National Security Advisors. I wanted to start with you, General Jones, and just leap right into it, which is, do you think in the Middle East, the Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas can really get to peace, or should we take more aggressive actions there?
Well, I think the administration has worked diligently with both of these gentlemen for quite a while. It hasn't really, I mean, it's been not quite 2 years, but we've certainly spent a lot of time with both, trying to bring them to the table and try to get them to understand just how important it is strategically, globally, that we find a solution to the Middle East problem writ large. You know, I don't know when the time comes when you go to another solution, but it's clear that we are having a difficult time figuring out exactly what it is that gets them to the substantive part of the discussion, because the lines have been drawn at a pretty tactical level. So the strategic discussion and the global ramifications of a failure to find a solution to this long-standing problem, which around which I might add that it seems to me that there's a convergence of views between the Europeans, the Arab world, the United States, that this is a moment that, even though we've not reached success yet, but this is a moment that has enormous potential if only we can figure out the right vectors to get the two parties.
But the convergence of views in the Arab and European world is that it's time for the U.S. to table a peace plan. I know you can't speak for the administration on this, you're out, but personally, would you be in favor of that?
That's been advocated, certainly, by some of the leaders of the Arab world and the Europeans, and it's certainly something that the administration at some point might have to consider. But whatever it is, we have to find a solution to this. The failure is not an option here. And one of the reasons that we have this synergy that I think it represents some hope for the future is that the shadow of Iran really lurks ominously on the horizon as a potentially bigger problem for the Arab world, and one that they seem to want to they want to address. But before they can do that, they want to get this Middle East situation figured out. So I think there's enormous opportunity internationally to figure out the way to bring the two parties together. The question is, what's the best way to do it, and at what time do you shift to another strategy?
What would be the outlines of do we know what the outlines of a plan is?
Well, I think it's been said that most everybody knows what it's going to look like. I mean, what end state is, 90, 93, 94, 95%. The question is, how do you get there? Do you get there all at once? Do you get there sequentially? Do you get there gradually? And on that issue of gradualism, I found that the Palestinians are actually, reasonably receptive to a certain time frame by which things will happen, rather than to say nothing's agreed to till everything's agreed to. That part of it, I don't think is a major stumbling block. But I think what it looks like is, at the end, is fairly well known right now.
Do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu is willing to give up land?
Well, I don't know. I think, you know, obviously he's got a difficult coalition to deal with. It is, as a result of the nature of it, it's difficult to get sometimes to get a clear picture of exactly what it is that it takes to move forward, because you know, many times we thought we were going to make progress only to find that we couldn't get there. So it's a little bit, to use an analogy like a Peanuts analogy, like Lucy in the football, and somebody's got to hold that football so we can kick a field goal.
Well, I mean, isn't it frustrating to be the guy who keeps coming up to the football and it gets pulled away?
It has its moments, yes.
All right. Dr. Hadley, do you have any more cause for optimism, and if so, how would we get there?
Well, I think there is cause for optimism. As General Jones said, everybody knows what the solution is. It's two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. Palestine as a homeland for the Palestinian people and their citizens. Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people and their Israeli citizens. And because of the negotiations under President Clinton and President Bush, you know, a lot of the contours of what the deal is going to look like are out there. Second, I think there are a lot of incentives to do this. You know, President Abbas made history 5 years ago when he campaigned for president on the notion that you need to get to a Palestinian state through negotiation, not violence. But, you know, that's 5 years ago. And at some point, he needs to show that this bold decision he made is going to work. Netanyahu has a historic opportunity to end Israel's isolation and end the delegitimization campaign against Israel and establish Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people in the Middle East forever. The Arab leaders clearly want peace. Salam Fayyad and Abbas are building the institutions of a Palestinian state now under occupation, which is very important because it both shows the Palestinians that a state is real, and it shows the Israelis that that state will not be a safe haven for terror. So I think there are a lot of incentives. How do you get there? One, we've got to somehow get the debate off the issue of settlements and construction freezes onto the issue of the terms of peace. The settlements issue politically is a winner for Netanyahu, a loser for us. If we get onto the issue of the terms of peace, that's a debate that we still, public opinion shows, both 60+% of Palestinians and Israelis want the peace. So let's get the debate.
How do we do that? Would tabling a plan help?
I think the issue of tabling a plan is something we ought to do, but timing is everything. Because, you know, we're running out of arrows in our quiver. And the plan is the biggest, best arrow we've got left. And it's got to be done at a time where it'll catalyze progress and not become a dead letter. So I think it is an element of an end game. The question is when. I think now, with this settlement issue still in front of us, it's premature. Mm-hmm. And what I would hope we would get, and Secretary Clinton has been signaling this, we need to get a negotiation going. We need to start on the issue of borders and security. We need to try to get a preliminary agreement on borders and securities because that moots the issue of settlements. Everybody
and that
knows,
can be done in 90 days, you think?
I think it can be done in fairly short order. It moots the issue of settlements. And then the question becomes, and it's an interesting debate, do you actually stand up that state, a state with provisional borders, while you continue to work the issues of right of return?
And that gets to the issue of whether the United States should agree to veto any UN resolution that recognizes that Palestinian state as a agreement with Israel that it will exercise its veto. Should the U.S. give that to Israel?
It depends.
That guarantee to Israel? It
depends. And, you know, I think the administration has to be careful that it doesn't, in trying to convince the parties to get beyond the settlement issue, make some commitments that in fact get in the way of what may be a path to resolution. So I think you got to be careful at
How
this
do
point
you
in
see
time.
that, General?
Well, I think that Steve, you know, lays it out pretty well. I believe that, personally believe that statehood, however that's defined, is a benefit, immediate benefit for the Palestinians, because it gives them international legitimacy, gives them all kinds of things.
In
that
other
they don't
words,
have
UN
right now.
recognition of a
Yeah.
Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And I would, and if they're willing to, as I think they are, if they're willing to agree to reasonable gradualism in terms of how you get to the final status, and that is somehow guaranteed that it's not something that's going to take 30 years or 20 years or maybe even 10 years, whatever that number is. I have a feeling it's no more than 10, but somewhere between 0 and 10. I just think their cause would be dramatically enhanced by being a state to start with.
Can you imagine them being recognized as a state without there being an Israeli-Palestinian agreement?
I think that would mean a major shift in how we've been approaching this in terms of trying to stimulate both parties to see that this is in their interest, ultimately. But, frankly, I think both parties genuinely want to achieve this solution, but they're inhibited by their local politics, if you will, for taking that dramatic step.
You were very close to Zippy Livni. I'm sorry, Dr. Hadley.
I don't think you can do it over the Israeli objection, but I think what Jim and I have in mind is if you could get a negotiation on borders and security and could get Israelis and Palestinians to agree on what that is, then the proposition you put to both of them is, wouldn't it advance the process and actually be both in Palestinian and Israeli interests if we went ahead and stood up that state with provisional borders, security and borders having been resolved, and then go on to the issues of right of return in Jerusalem? That would be the proposition. The question is whether you could persuade the Israelis that that was in their interest.
And frankly, I think this is probably the one thing that a country like Iran does not want to see happen, because that immediately changes the equation with regard to Hamas and some of these other organizations, and dramatically, I think, enhances President Abbas as the leader of the new nation. So, to me, strategically, in a geopolitical sense, this would be a good thing.
I'm going to take a quick break for what we call sponsors. I want to thank Sami and Huda Farouki for sponsoring this, and lead into a question, because I see Gene Case here from the U.S. Palestinian Partnership, Burl Bernhardt and Bill Mayer, who are with our Middle East Investment Initiative. And General Jones, before you even went into the administration, you worked with a lot of us, the U.S. Palestinian Partnership and the Investment Initiative, to try to build up the economy in the Palestinian territories, and in particular the West Bank. We work with Dr. Salam Fayyad. The Middle East Investment Initiative that Bill and Burl are involved with now has how much money in loan guarantees? 70 million in loan guarantees out. Our U.S. Palestinian Partnership, I think Gene Case, you just stood up a venture fund now to go with it. What you want to say what that is?
Sure. Well, we're very excited. We're coming to our first close on a $50 million venture fund, all targeted in the West Bank, most of it toward technology companies. And we've just been excited about the amount of traction we've seen from the U.S. private sector putting investment in the West Bank.
Now, that leads to the question, is this good for the peace process, or is it in some ways, as some people fear, a way of helping Netanyahu just placate the Palestinians and not get to the peace process?
Well, I mean, my view hasn't changed from when I was working actually with Steve and Secretary Rice, and I should publicly also thank them for that opportunity, because it was clearly one of the most interesting things I've ever done, certainly in a short period of time, and been able to be a part of. And Tony Blair, by the way, has also been very, very helpful in all of this. But and the idea was basically to help the Palestinian Authority assert its governance over the West Bank, and in so doing, to show that it would succeed not just in Jenin, but if the Jenin model worked, to expand it.
Hebron and
to expand it. It was kind of a bottom-up economic approach that would stimulate the whole of the everyday life of Palestinians on the West Bank, and would also have a dramatic effect on, hopefully, on Gaza, and to show that there is a better way. There is a way in which you can live in peace and security. And and I was pleased to see the Israeli reaction to this as well. The IDF under General Ashkenazi changed its strategy from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency. And that wasn't an easy thing for them to do. But under the rubric of if they do more, we will do less, they've built up, I think, over time, a pretty healthy relationship with the security forces of the Palestinians, and they've been generally pleased with what they've seen. And I still think it's still a very good model, and I think it's not a way for the Israelis to placate them, to keep the status quo ante, but I think it's what has to happen if we're going to be successful in the future. So the top-down issue is important because that's at the international level, but this bottom-up approach also has its own energy and force that brings it towards I think the solution that everybody wants to see.
I completely agree with that. I think it's one of the most hopeful things going on now, what's being done there, because there's a lot of cynicism about whether there's ever going to be a Palestinian state, and if so, what kind of state it's going to be. And by building the institutions of Palestinian state now, even under occupation, it reassures the Palestinian that they can actually see the state beginning to emerge, that it's real, and it reassures the Israelis that it's going to be the right kind of state, a statement that is already cooperating with Israeli security forces to deal with terror. I think there are a lot of people who will say, well, then let's just kind of shelve the negotiation for a while, and let's just focus on this bottom up. And I think it's a close question, but I think the better argument is that Salam Fayyad and the institution building can only go so far without the political cover of a credible negotiations. Right. And that's why I think the administration concluded it's both top-down and bottom-up.
How much time does Dr. Fayyad have if he doesn't get it, if there's
no
political settlement?
He has said, he's got a 2-year program, and it is to be completed in the fall of 2011, and it'll be very interesting what happens at that point, what decisions the Palestinians make, what decisions the Israelis make, and what decisions the United States make. And I think it depends a lot on where we are, whether there's an active peace negotiation, whether it's making progress.
Dr. Fayyad, when Salam Fayyad, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, announced his plan actually at the Aspen Ideas Festival a year ago in an interview with Tom Friedman, and he gave that 2-year horizon. And his argument was, with the help of the U.S. Palestinian Partnership and some of the things Aspen was doing, we will build a state in 2 years. And we're going to build it from the ground up with the economic and civil society and security institutions. And once we have built it, they can't deny it to us. The world community can't say you can't have your state if we have shown we have built a state. Does that mean at the end of 2011, no matter what the status is of the peace talks, the world should think about recognizing this Palestinian state?
I wouldn't say no matter what.
Okay, then
the status
modify my question.
I think the issue at that point will be on the table.
Okay.
And it'll be decided on the basis of where we are at that point in time.
Yeah. General Jones?
I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Brent, can I bring you in on this? Did you have some thoughts about what American policy should be toward the Middle East now?
I'm here to learn.
Okay. All right.
Well, I guess I think that the parties by themselves have demonstrated they're unlikely ever to be able to come to agreement by themselves. The circumstances are so different. One's strong, one's weak. They both have opposition groups. And it seems to me that for them to have a chance to get together, they have to do something like, to their own publics, we didn't want to do this, the United States made us. Mm-hmm. Something like that. They've got to have a scapegoat for doing what they both have to do but are unwilling to do it. So I think there has to be an impetus here.
And the impetus has to come from the president, or has the Secretary of State got more credibility at the moment in the region?
Oh, I think it has to come from the president. I mean, this is a big thing. The United States has never done anything like presenting, here's something. The Taba Accords in 2000, the timing wasn't good. but they laid out what
The
what
timing wasn't good
fundamental
because
is-
it was right
Well,
after the election.
It was the end. It was
End
the
of an
end of the
administration.
administration.
Right,
Just
that's
for a variety of things, but 67 borders with rectifications, no automatic right of return for the Palestinians, Jerusalem a capital of both countries, and a non-militarized Palestinian state. Now the problem if you go and just deal with borders is you can't deal with borders without taking up all of the other issues.
Why?
Well, because if you draw the borders, what happens to the people of the opposite sides that are on the wrong side of the border? So you've got to do the population thing, and part of the border is East Jerusalem. So I don't think it helps. It moves it ahead. I certainly agree that settlements is going after one part of it, which can't be solved separately. But to me, a comprehensive offer, because all of the issues now are interrelated.
So a comprehensive offer by the United States, pushed by the president. Do you think the president ought to take an offer or a proposal, we'll call it, and fly to Jerusalem and go to Bethlehem and Ramallah and speak
I don't
and
know
say
what he ought to do,
something
but it
dramatic?
seems to me that a U.S. proposal, I would say U.S., I think the Europeans would love it. The Arab world would obviously love it. To me, the worst outcome for the Israelis is the Palestinians give up on the two-state solution. That presents the Israelis with three fundamentally disastrous options. And so I think we need to get them to realize they need this as much as the Palestinians do.
General Jones, I saw you nodding. Will you?
Well,
And see
no, I agree with General Scowcroft that we are at a point where something has to happen, and I just don't think that it's likely that we'll have this this convergence between external entities and the Arab world, the Europeans, and us that are just, you know, that have this historic sense that this is the moment, this is the time, and we've got to figure out whatever that solution is to force this to its logical conclusion. And unfortunately, logic doesn't play a big role in this, because if you talk to both sides, they both logically say, we want to do this, but they won't let us. I mean, and we have to just find a way, as General Scowcroft
They won't
said.
let us, meaning our populations?
No,
in the case of Israel?
no, the other side. I mean,
Oh,
it's always about the other guy. So we simply have to find the right formula to take that step. And once you take it, I think then you might be into a whole new world that might be somewhat irreversible and very good.
And I think the administration actually has set that up. I agree with what Brent said. And I think the way around it, though, is I'm worried that if you wait until you have negotiated to close
That's right.
all of the final status issues, you'll never get there. It's just too hard. And so what I think the administration has set up is you have a framework agreement that sets out the basic principles on all of these issues. But you don't stop there. In addition, then, you say, with that framework agreement that gives some reassurance about how those other issues are going to come out, let's start and focus on border and securities. It's the area that's been most worked on, where I think there is the most convergence. Let's see if we can nail that down. And then you may have an option, as General Jones said, to see if you can convince the parties to actually stand up the Palestinian state. And that will be transformative. And I think it will buy you some time to then turn to the issues of the final terms of the right of return refugee issues and the Jerusalem issues, and then you can put it all together in a final status agreement. But I think you're going to have to eat this a little bit, a couple bites. I just think waiting for the grand, agreement, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, I think that's just too hard. And I think the administration's setting up actually the potential for a different kind of approach. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think I think so. I mean, I think that waiting until everything's agreed to is what we've been trying to do for a long time, and that.
So go for borders and security and do it in 90 days.
But do it with a
In the
framework
framework.
agreement
With the framework.
that
We know the
addresses
framework.
Brent's
The
concerns.
The
Some of the
framework is
things-
Taba,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
I don't know if Ambassador Mustafa will let me do, Dr. Mustafa will let me do this, but you know, the next question logically is whether there's a Syrian track. Dr. Mustafa is the ambassador from Syria. Do you have a question on that, or do you have any thoughts? I know that Senator Mitchell, Fred Hoff, and others have been trying to get a Syria track going. Did you want to either ask a question or say something about whether there is time for a Syrian track?
Thank you. I'm not going to say anything, but if you want me to ask
A
a question, I would like to hear some comments about, well, the Obama administration has been telling us as of day one that they believe, and this is a major difference as compared to previous administrations, that peace in our region cannot be achieved unless it is comprehensive and on all tracks. They do not believe that it can happen on one track, and they do not believe in the game played previously of playing one track against the other. So I would love to hear some comments on this if this is possible. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Mustafa. And also, if you would talk about whether or not you think it would be good in parallel or in sequence to do Syria.
I can tell you where Bush administration was. President Bush had a conversation with Prime Minister Olmert and urged him in the context of Annapolis to go after a comprehensive peace, including Syria, and hopefully, if you did Syria, then also Lebanon, that was the goal. And as everybody knows, there were negotiations, quiet negotiations between Israel and Syria, brokered by the Turks. And we were privately supportive of that, and actually authorized the Turks and the Israelis to tell the Syrians that actually improved relationships with the United States went through a Syrian-Israeli agreement. So we tried to be as supportive as we could of that track, and it made some progress, and then at the end, in 2008, it got overwhelmed by a whole series of things that everybody knows about. I think General Jones will speak that my sense is that the administration has really tried in good faith to try to get a Syria track going, and General Jones can talk about that.
No, I think that's correct. I think obviously it would be to everyone's advantage if the peace that we have in mind extended to a broader area. It included Syria and Lebanon. And I think the administration, I know the administration has been working quietly to see what the potential is to do that on several fronts. And they continue, since I'm no longer part of the administration, to, I think, work on the comprehensive nature of it in an open and hopefully a very productive way. But it is, there is reason for some optimism there, I think, on the part of all players who have been talked about, who we've talked to on this issue, and it's certainly something that would be in everybody's interest.
How would this help us on Iran?
I beg your pardon?
How would this help on Iran?
Well, I think obviously if you are able to achieve consensus and results in obtaining a peace that is foundational for the region and that you build upon, it serves to isolate Iran a little bit more than perhaps it is right now. And I think that the combination of that was peaceful negotiations plus the sanctions that we know are having will have a major effect, and it certainly will send a very strong message to Iran that perhaps it is time to return to the table and start negotiating seriously. And
how do you see if Syria and Lebanon are actually more stable and are at peace with Israel and not, does that isolate Iran?
I think it does. I think it's a good thing in itself, and it also, I think, sends a message to Iran about what the direction of the Middle East peace and the Middle East is going to be. But there are more fundamental issues with Iran, and one, of course, is the nuclear program, but one is the nature of that regime and the unhappiness many people within Iran are showing with that.
Do you think sanctions are helping a lot?
It's interesting, and there may be some comments from people here on sanctions. I have been surprised and pleased at how well the administration did in terms of getting people around the table to impose sanctions. They did better than I expected that they would, and it's through a lot of effort of a lot of folks. One of the things that occurred to me the other day, and I need to talk to people to get a better feel for, but the theory of sanctions is you're putting a lot of pressure, particularly on business classes and middle classes, to in turn put pressure on the regime. But it's interesting, Ahmadinejad and the regime is also putting pressure on the middle class, because that, of course, is the center of the opposition to the regime. And I wonder whether we don't have actually a perverse alliance between our sanctions activities and Iranian regime policy. Everybody's squeezing the middle class. So I worry about that, but I think sanctions are right. I worry that they are not going to be enough. And I think you need to marry sanctions with major support in a way that does not discredit them for the forces of change in Iran, because I think it's actually domestic pressure for change that is more likely to convince the regime that they don't want both a domestic confrontation and an international confrontation at the same time, and may be more willing to deal. And then finally, I think we have to start thinking now very seriously of what happens if this does not work. We have a lot of false debates, I think, on Iran. This debate we've had about can Iran be deterred, I think it's a false debate. Can Iran be deterred from using nuclear weapons against the United States? Of course. But can we deter the adverse effects that come once it's clear that Iran has a clear path to a nuclear weapon? I don't think so. What are those things? An empowered Iran, more willing to support terror, more willing to interfere with its neighbors both propitiating Iran and then going after their own nuclear programs with enrichment and reprocessing, so that Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Saudi have the same options that Iran does. I think we need to think seriously about the problems of Iran with a clear path to nuclear weapon. And secondly, I think we've had another false argument about this issue of, do you go to war against Iran? It's easy to demonstrate that that would be a leap into a dark and a very difficult thing, but that's not the right question. The question is there some way we can visibly set aside and set back, for example, their activity on Natanz, which is the way, which is the route for a nuclear weapon capability for Iran? Can we visibly set that back in some way?
I'm sorry, by a military strike?
Diplomatically, by some other means, to visibly set it back, because our President Obama has said not just that nuclear Iran is unacceptable, he says that we will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That is a high bar.
But I'm sorry, how do you stop Natanz other than striking it if sanctions don't work?
One is diplomatically and focusing on it, hoping sanctions work. Secondly, I think what the administration needs to do is think of other options.
Like cyber, like whatever that Vorman virus
there is what is Stuxnet?
Stuxnet.
And what is that all about? Is that an option? I don't know. The other thing is and it's difficult, but look at what the Israeli did in taking out the Syrian nuclear reactor, something that was done pretty covertly, not acknowledged. Syria decided to let it go. There was no retaliation. My only point is, I think we've had a big public debate of sort of to go to war, Iran, or not. And I think we need a more sophisticated public debate about what do we do if we get to the point that we are faced with this stark choice of either going to war, which nobody wants to do, or accepting Iran with a clear path to a nuclear weapon, which also, I think, is unacceptable.
Steve, I think that's a great summation. I would just simply add a couple of things. One is that I think the President's thinking on this has been consistent all along. The idea was from the outgo, was to see if Iran was willing to negotiate reasonably, but to always leave the door open even as we move towards sanctions. The sanctions result, at least the process, the UN, the EU, and then individual countries, was really, I think, a foreign policy achievement that hasn't received its just due, simply because of how hard it was, and the fact that at the end of the day, even Russia and China came into the sanctions protocols. The close relationship with the EU that followed on the heels of the UN sanctions was also very, very welcome, and not something that just happened automatically. It was something that the United States participated in assiduously, rigorously. And I think we're still 6 to 8 months away from having the full effect of the sanctions.
And so what happens if they don't work in 8 months?
Well, I think that, as Steve pointed out, we're not, obviously we're not just betting on that and nothing else.
Right.
There's an awful lot of dialogue with other countries, the Israelis in particular. I think this has had a calming effect in terms of the the hype about you've got to do something now. I think Steve's right. I think there are really three reasons why a nuclear Iran is a bad idea. First is the fact that you'd have another nuclear state, nuclear capable state, but you can deter that. Mm-hmm. But secondly, the fact that it would probably trigger a nuclear arms race in the Middle East is something that is pretty well foregone conclusion. That would be very bad. And thirdly, and the one that I think is really the nightmare scenario, because I think it would, without trying to overstate things, but it might change the world that we live in, is a country like Iran exporting that kind of technology to a terrorist organization.
Would a joint Israeli-U.S. military action be far more likely or just more likely if we had a Palestinian-Israeli peace? Not likely, but doable. Does it help solve Iran if we can get a Palestinian-Israeli peace?
I think a peace process that is ongoing and people can see is moving in the right direction is probably one of the best things that we could do to show Iran that its path is the wrong path. I think it's extremely important to leave the door open, as we have, both on official channels and unofficial channels with Iran. And they have shown indications of a certain willingness to come back, at least to the conference table. We'll wait and see exactly whether that happens or not. But I wouldn't necessarily throw in the towel right now and say sanctions aren't going to work, or they are, and I wouldn't go too far the other way to start prognosticating on what we might do if the sanctions don't work, because I think one of the things that's happened between, let's say, us and the Russians and the Israelis and others that are concerned is we have arrived at a kind of a sense of what that timing is. We know a lot more about their program. We know that their program is having some difficulty. And we generally have a more common view as opposed to 18 months ago where we had 3 different views.
Well, what is your knowledge of the Stuxnet thing that you could, that we could know whether it set it back? Did it set it back?
I'm not going to talk about that.
Let me say 4 things about this. One, I'm not, rushing. I think we ought to let the sanctions go forward. I'm just sort of saying you need to look forward to where we might be a year from now and be doing some careful planning about it. Second of all, I think one of the impacts of the election is that there will probably be more support for President Obama in whatever decisions he makes, should we get to that point. And I think I noted particularly the comments that Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator John McCain made at the Halifax Security Conference here a couple weeks ago, where they were very tough about regime change and use of military force.
Will there be support for him if he does something strong?
I think there was support for him to do something strong if we get to that point. Right. If we get to that point, and if the sanctions don't work. And lastly, I would say, I think if there is some difficult work that needs to be done, I think it's needs to be done by the United States, not Israel. I don't think we should.
In other words, a military or covert action
I think
has to be done
if
with
there
the
is
United
something
States.
that needs to be done at
Right.
the end of the day, I think it's not something you should.
And then
put
real
on-
quickly, and
on
then we'll
Israel.
open it up, but 4 or 5 times you've mentioned how helpful Russia has been on this Iran situation. I'm going to get all 3 of you in, General Scowcroft, if I may. How harmful would it be to this process if the START treaty is not ratified by the Senate?
Well, I think it would be extremely harmful. And I think it would be a blow to the prestige of the United States. It certainly would be a blow to the president, which is not a good thing in terms of his clout around the world, his influence. And especially at a time when I think the United States has reasserted its leadership with regard to nuclear issues. And all of the things that have been done working towards this the START treaty, which I think was done in consultation with both sides of the Hill on a regular basis. There was a clear understanding of what the red lines were from some of the would-be opponents, and I think we worked really hard to try to meet those red lines. So I think that there's all kinds of reasons for passage for this START treaty, and I shudder to think what would happen if we didn't get it.
Dr. Hadley?
I'm probably a little bit in the middle. One, I think Russia has actually been quite cooperative for the Bush administration and for the Obama administration. Long set of things in terms of how they handled Bashir and active in the negotiations. Bush administration got 4 UN security sanctions resolutions. Russia supported all of them. 2, I don't think Russia will stop that cooperation if we have problems with the START treaty, but I think it's an unnecessary argument. And there are some problems with the START agreement. They can be and should be addressed in the resolution of ratification, and that is being done. We need to get agreement on the modernization program, so as long as we have nuclear weapons, which will be for a considerable period of time, they are modern. So I think there is a way forward that early on in the new Congress, we can get...
In other words, not in the lame duck.
Not in the lame duck. Early on in the new Congress, we can get a good number of Republicans joining Democrats and ratifying
And you
the
think
treaty.
Senator Kyle will agree to a modernization proposal, and that could be break the logjam?
I think there is a modernization program that he and a lot of other people can agree with. These, a lot of people, Brent Scowcroft and I were both up testifying, we both talked about the need for a modernization program. So I think it can be done, and I'd like to see it done that way rather than rammed through the lame duck, because I think it would be a good start for the new Congress working with the President to be able to show that we can get the nation's business done on a bipartisan basis. And I think that's what Republicans and Democrats ought to try to achieve in the new term, after they have addressed these concerns that have been raised, which I think should be addressed, but which I think can be addressed.
General Scowcroft?
Well, I very much agree with Jim, with Steve partly, because I don't see the objections to the treaty. None of them are really advanced by rejecting the treaty. That's my problem.
In other words,
In other
you don't
words,
serve
some
your
of them
purpose
need to
by
be
rejecting.
fixed, but they need to be fixed by follow-on negotiations with the Russians, which can only happen if we ratify the treaty. I think that psychologically it will hurt the reset with Russia. I agree they're not going to make decisions based on that, but the whole progress that we've had with Russians, not only on Iran, on supply lines to Afghanistan, there is a gradual thawing here, and we ought to encourage it and strengthen it. And therefore, I think it would be negative.
Samia, did you have a question?
Actually, it was answered. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think Ambassador Hosanna of the Arab League, or the League of Arab States, I guess is the official name of it.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Samia and Abul Hoda for sponsoring this meeting. I think it's a great idea. I have three small comments to make. First of all, I think there's a really urgent need for the United States to present this comprehensive framework to the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Arab League has its peace initiative, which in a way is a comprehensive framework to deal with all the issues. But talking from my experience when I was involved in Egyptian-Israeli peace negotiations, I think if President Carter had not presented his own proposals and ideas to both sides, we wouldn't have reached an agreement. And I don't think that what the Israelis fear sometimes, that this should be imposed on the parties. It's just a proposal put on the table, and then it is a basis for negotiation between the parties. My second comment is about what Israel is trying now to get from the United States, a pledge to veto any attempt by the Palestinians to go to the Security Council and obtain an endorsement to the Palestinian state. I think this is a very unhelpful development if this happens, because the United States should be perceived throughout as an honest broker that takes no sides. And if it uses the veto against a resolution proposed by the Palestinians or the Arab world or the Muslim world, I think it will affect this image of honest broker. Thirdly, on the question of Iran and the threat of nuclear weapons, why shouldn't a solution being in establishing in the Middle East a zone free of all weapons, of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction? This is another proposal. We think everyone should apply to everyone, including the Iranians, the Arabs, Israel, and we should have a zone that is free of all threats. Thank you.
Did you any comments on that, or do you just want to take it under advisement?
I'll just say three things. One, I think at some bridging proposals will be part of how you get to peace. At some point, you may want to lay down a comprehensive proposal, particularly if we're talking about a framework agreement. But timing is everything. And you've seen a lot of things get played, mistimed, and had no effect. Second, a UN resolution, it's a complicated question. I think the best thing to do is to try to get these negotiations back on track. In terms, look, we've been a lot of discussion about, nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, and I think generally people feel that once you have a Middle East peace, because there are other threats other than just nuclear weapons to security in the region, once you get a comprehensive Middle East peace, then we can talk about how to build on that peace.
Yes, questions. Glenn Kessler, is that Arno? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Just to take back to the Middle East, one subject that hasn't come up are the 1.5 million people that...
The 1.5?
One subject that hasn't come up is Gaza, where 1.5 million Palestinians live. And, a lot of the focus of the administration, which makes sense, is on making some sort of peace agreement with Mahmoud Abbas, who of course is in charge of the West Bank. But what should be done with Gaza? How do you ultimately incorporate that part of the Palestinian territories into a Palestinian state? And is there a point at which you begin to reach out to Hamas?
General Jones, you take that one.
I'm going to defer to the dean.
Can you do it without Gaza?
Why am I answering the question?
General Jones.
Well, I'll just venture to say that I believe if we begin to make progress on a Palestinian peace, the Hamas cannot afford to be left out. And we take away some of the leverage they have now just saying no by beginning to move, and they'll feel compelled to participate.
That's right. I mean, I think that this, we talked about the top-down and the bottom-up approach being complementary. if we can get those two things working, then the whole situation with Hamas is different, and the whole situation with Iran is different. So I really think that the West Bank is where we start. We recognize that ultimately what the state will look like at some point, but that doesn't mean that you can't make progress now. You don't. Trying to fix this now will only mean that you're going to delay the progress of getting the two-state solution in the future.
If you get a peace deal that involves the establishment of a Palestinian state on the West Bank, then President Obama is in a position to go to Hamas and say, are you in or you're out? If you're in, you have to give up terror, you have to accept these agreements, the quartet conditions. And if Hamas says, no, we're out, then he has an opportunity to go to the people of Gaza and say, your choice. Do you want to live where you are in Gaza under these conditions, or do you want to be part of a hopeful Palestinian state? I think Jim's right. It will, and Brent is right, it will, if you can get that peace and show that a Palestinian state is coming in the West Bank, it's going to reshuffle the deck in terms of the whole Gaza question. But I think it's the only way to get Gaza resolved.
Glenn, does that get you? Yeah. Let me, Arno, and then I'll move around this way. Sorry, and then, yeah, I see everybody. Arno.
Is it a hopeful sign when President Obama? Is it a hopeful sign when President Obama extends a $3 billion inducement to Israel in return for simply 90 days of a settlement freeze, nothing else?
Want to take that?
Well, I mean, this is the matter on the table as to how what is the what makes it worthwhile to do this in exchange for a 90-day settlement freeze. The Israelis, to my knowledge, have not responded to that yet, and so we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But it is the discussions between the U.S. and Israel on Israel's security have been ongoing with some tremendous detail and specificity for the last year. And I think that the United States and the administration has been extremely generous, even right up to this point, forgetting the current negotiations, in providing assurances to Israel that their security is something that we pay a lot of attention to. But I also want to come back to the point that I think it's extremely important that the United States also be perceived as being an honest broker in the region. And you have to be careful that the scales don't tilt too far one way or the other.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know all the ins and outs of it, and it's impossible from the outside. It makes a lot of sense. The worry I have is I think this settlement freeze thing, the construction freeze, has not worked, has not done what the administration hoped it would do. And at some point, if you're in a hole, you stop digging. And I just am not sure sort of going another 90 days, so we end up 90 days from now where we are now, is maybe the best outcome. But again, I'm not party to these discussions. There may be a lot more there. But I
stop
think,
digging by allowing the settlements continue, but maybe...
Well, or go the other way and say, look, the formality of a freeze on construction is a problem. We need to get some other understandings that address Palestinian concerns but also address Israeli politics, and get off the settlement issue and get onto the issue of negotiating the peace, because that's where we ought to be. And we've got to get there before we go into another U.S. presidential election cycle, before leaders in the Arab world start retiring or dying. We've got to get on with it.
Huda, you're sponsoring this lunch. I'm going to let you jump the queue.
Thank you.
This is a donor maintenance call.
Thank you, Walt. And thank everybody for being here. I really have been privileged to work closely with Walt at the Aspen Institute, and Tony. And the Aspen Institute has done phenomenal work over many years
Bergman,
now.
Let's give him a shout out too.
And Mickey. And phenomenal work over many years in support of the Palestinian people on the ground. And it's made a tangible difference on numerous visits that I've made to the region. I've actually seen that firsthand. And furthermore, I'd like to kind of draw our attention one more time to what General Scowcroft said, and that is a two-state solution is in fact perhaps jeopardized at this point and continues as a result of pessimism on the ground to be further jeopardized. And at what point do we actually reach, at what stage do we reach a point where it becomes not an option anymore? Are we close to that or not?
Can we get, what is the alternative?
I don't think we're close to that because of the synergy that exists between the Arab world, the Europeans, and the U.S. The outside watching world really is more together on the necessity to be successful than perhaps at any time in my memory. And so I think that the prize is still on the table, it's still achievable. We've not figured out the right combination yet, but I'm impressed by the fact that everybody who plays in this game really passionately believes that there has to be a solution. It's not just a regional problem. It has a problem of global dimensions, and solving this will help the world that we live in many, many different ways.
Burl and then Bill.
Well, I think most of my concerns have been addressed, but I'm very much concerned with reading, and I presume it's true, that this offer has been made by the United States in the terms that have already been discussed. The question that really is a concern is you're dealing, and it hasn't really been discussed, with an essentially fragile Palestinian Authority. While the economy has improved and the security has improved, it is nonetheless an occupied area which has its own unique problems. What concerns me is you talk about our having to be an honest broker, and you talk about the timing problem as being crucial. I accept all that, but if you're in the Palestinian West Bank right now, and I don't want to get into the Hamas issue, how uncomfortable would you be if you knew that there was a kind of a proposal where the Israelis, as an occupying power, will receive more ordnance, more strike fighters, and that kind of thing, and exactly why would that bring the Palestinians to the table? I would think that it would drive them away, and that's what concerns me greatly. And then you look at the end of the 90-day period, and while there is some optimism expressed in the long run as a matter of necessity, what is going to happen? What is the, let's assume that it doesn't work, and for various reasons of politics, the Palestinians don't feel comfortable coming back to the table under these circumstances. What happens then? Whether it's Steve or the General or Brent or anybody, I just...
Is that the time you table a proposal, if you were not speaking for the administration, just yourself?
Well, I would simply say that it would seem to me that we would want to make things conditional on progress. That if in fact we did X, that Y would be the result, and if Y fails, then X is off the table. I think you have to tie some of these things to good faith and a demonstrated will to be courageous and to make some of these decisions so that we can move in the right direction.
But to pin you down, the $3 billion in security ordinance shouldn't be done unless there is some real tangible.
My personal opinion would be that the president would expect that there would be some tangible momentum that would lead to follow-on progress. I don't know that for a fact. I had left the administration before they made this proposal I've read about as well. But I think you can't simply just keep putting down payments on things that don't work out.
Right. Bill, and then I see many hands. I'm trying to keep them in order.
Just to get back to Iran for a second and the issue of sanctions, and if I were the advisor to the Iranian government, I would say something like, steady as you go. It's working pretty good. Been a lot of talk. Been sanctions. hasn't hurt that much as far as at least the government. I think your point where the government, in a strange way, the UN sanctions are pressing the same group. I cannot imagine, as a law of probabilities, that sanctions are going to work. And so I say, all right, in business, you deal with the law of probabilities, and there must be a plan B and a plan C. But I'm always kind of surprised. If I were an advisor to the Iranian government, I said before, steady as you go, and yet we're talking about sanctions, and I know you have to try, but when sanctions, when it becomes accepted, not obvious, that they're not going to work, something else is going to happen. Has to. Did I say that wrong?
That was pretty clear. And I think, look, I mean, this is an open forum, but I think one has to have faith that responsible people are thinking about these things as well. I mean, you know, we can't talk about it necessarily in a public forum before the event happened. We hope the sanctions work. We hope the sanctions create a sense of logic and reason in the Iranian leadership to bring them back to the table. That door is open. But if it doesn't, I will go back to what Steve said. Our declared statement by the President of the United States that we will prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. That is still on the table.
That's a pretty straightforward statement. David McCuskey, were you raising your hand way back there?
I actually wasn't, but I just got back. I just got back on Friday, and just to get to Beryl's point, and I saw President Abbas last week, and a lot of his people, and Prime Minister Fayyad and a lot of his people. I actually was more optimistic that even with this rumored package, that they will come to the table, and that the key to me is what happens when they get there, because well, Steve Hadley knows that I very much share this view of, I've written about borders a year and a half ago. I think it's the one way to go because I think the convergences are possible. What was striking to me on the Jerusalem part of the trip was the opposition that this idea is hitting, because they feel that their cards, so to speak, are all territorial. So that leads them to believe they have to move forward on all issues, which in theory is what we all want. Everyone will be unanimous in this room. We all want progress on all issues. I'm just skeptical that they have, on either side, have conditioned the societal landscape on Jerusalem and refugees. And once you know, all of a sudden saying borders and security now almost like a dirty word over there, and I think it's a mistake. That's my personal view. Steve knows it very well. But I think that's the one way. I don't think we can solve these issues in 90 days. I don't think anyone believes you can. But I think you can make progress. But I think you're going to have, you're coming up, even with some of the more moderate elements in the Netanyahu coalition, against this approach. So I think there's still some work to be done here.
Right. George Salem, one of the founders of our U.S.-Palestinian partnership.
Thanks, Walter, and thanks to the Faroukis and for their 3 former national security advisors for their commitment to peace, both in and out of government. I was in Cairo in 1995 negotiating the final details of the creation of the Palestinian Authority. That was to be a 1-year temporary status. That was 15 years ago, and we're in the same legal limbo where the Palestinians don't have sovereignty, they don't have borders, they don't have access or control over water or air or the rest of it. Everybody thinks that we have about 6 months to negotiate, make real progress on negotiation of a 2-state solution if the United States is to lead those negotiations because of our status, our political process here. A concern that a number of us have is that the conditions that are being set by the Israelis for the extension of the moratorium are going to be so great that the ultimate achievement of a 2-state solution will be potentially nullified. It's certainly severely diminished, because those of us that have been in this business for most of our lives know that 3 months is not a very long time to negotiate something as important as borders. And if you have a border agreement that doesn't encompass Jerusalem, it's a non-starter in terms of all of the Palestinian, all the members of the Arab League. So the best mechanism other than a negotiation for an independent Palestinian state is the UN Accord, which Prime Minister Salam Fayyad is working very diligently on under the leadership of Abu Mazen. And that will be presented potentially in 2011. If there is a U.S. veto threatened or committed, that will severely undercut that option. And so then you are going to be led to a one-state solution, which, quite frankly, I think the majority of the people in Palestine today are leaning towards, particularly the young entrepreneurs, because they don't have much faith in the honest brokerism of the United States or Americans, or the ability of the Israelis to give up land that they have been colonizing and occupying since 1967. So all of this is a way of asking, if we don't get it done in 3 months, what?
Look, in some sense, you have the wrong witnesses up here. I mean,
You have the choir, not the
I've indicated my skepticism of this approach, but said I don't really know the details. General Jones was more circumspect than that. But in a way, the questions you raised are serious questions, but they're really got to go to the administration. Mm-hmm. They're really not for us, to be honest. And it sounds like a dodge, but I think, you know, I share a lot of those concerns. But you know, they're going to questions that have to be put to the administration, and they're going to have to explain why they think this approach is anything other than continuing to dig in the hole that we've been in.
General Jones, do you think it would be useful if an administration, now that you're not in one, said if this approach doesn't go very far, at some point we will have to recognize a Palestinian state if there is indeed a viable state on the West Bank?
Well, these are hypothetical. I mean, it's a hypothetical that may come our way, but
not all that hypothetical.
Yeah, but I think I'll pass on that one.
Salam Fayyad is trying to set that up. Look,
Correct.
He said his formulation is, I want to get to the point after 2 years where the only thing wrong with the Palestinian state is occupation. Because he wants to put maximum pressure to get this issue resolved. I think from his standpoint, it's a good path. It's a good strategy.
General Jones?
The question
From his
is how to
standpoint, it makes
respond to
sense.
it.
And
we'll see what happens.
but we will leave open that option as opposed to preclude it by threatening a veto?
I don't know.
David? I'm sorry. Yeah, David?
Thank you.
I would just say I think that's the least attractive way out of this problem. For a lot of reasons. The negotiating outcome with everybody in agreement is much to be preferred.
Better.
Just is. Sorry, David.
I just want to sound a cautionary note about the idea of this new approach, which would be a framework agreement and then focusing on borders and security. First of all, I just do not see the Palestinian or the Israelis being willing to now endorse Jerusalem as the capital of both states. This government simply would not do that. If you set that aside and simply start to negotiate on borders, again, you run into the question of Jerusalem. And even if you carved it out as something to be worked on later, then you get immediately the question of settlements. And we're right back where we are today. So I just raised that as a caution.
What I would like to do, if I may, since there are a few others, I know Randa and Judith and all, I'm going to let a few people make comments or questions, and then at 1:30 allow you all to answer the ones you want and duck, and ignore the ones you want to duck, since we put you too much on the spot already. Randa and then Judith.
Mine actually dovetails onto his comment, which is, what if President Abbas said to the United States, fine, with this 90-day moratorium freeze, except for East Jerusalem, I will come back to the table if, and as all the panelists said, we all know what the end game looks like. The Palestinians want East Jerusalem as their capital, and yet we're giving the nod to Netanyahu, go ahead and build your settlements in East Jerusalem. Wink, wink. What if Abbas said, fine, I'll come back to the table if the U.S. promises me to pay for dismantling every single settlement in East Jerusalem that Netanyahu's building, and to pay for relocating all those individuals who are sitting in those settlements illegally right now.
Judith?
Thank you. with having 3 national security advisors with us, I'd like to ask the question. Since 1979, the U.S. has been very busy at peace processing, envoys, plans, et cetera, but we haven't achieved very much. The big things were done by the parties themselves. But since Taba and the Arab Peace Initiative, and the fact that everybody, the most hardline people in this town, in the West Bank, in the mountains of Afghanistan, know what the final solution looks like, why is it so hard for a president? What is the impediment for a president who really wants it to get this done? Because every American who understands something about Israel knows that the support for Israel runs through the blood of the body politic of Americans. It's not a Jewish issue in the U.S. Secondly, the safety, security, the fulfillment of the Zionist dream will not be done until the Israelis draw a line with the Palestinians. It is only the Palestinians that can legitimize, finally, for good and forever, the Disraeli state. So why can't we get this done?
Let me see if there are any people in our peanut gallery there that didn't get a seat at the table. I don't want to discriminate there. Was there a comment or question back there? Final thoughts? All right, let me start, if I may. General Scowcroft, do you mind giving us your final comments on some of the last questions that were asked, and then we'll move down this.
Rest.
You'll just rest? How can we tell? All right. General Jones.
Well, the second question is that why is it hard for the president to do this? Because it is hard. I mean, it is hard because of the history, of the emotion. It's hard because it's so important to everything that we do. To me, it's the one thing. I told the president this in 2009, shortly after he took office. I said, if you could pick one thing that you could fix, with all the problems that there are, I think it should be the Middle East, and I think that remains really at the top of our work. The question is, how do you do it? And governments change. Our government changed. The Israeli government changed. There was a period of adjustment that took most of 2009. We all know each other a little bit better now. They've had face-to-face meetings. We've had dialogues with the Palestinians and the Israelis, and I'm still remain optimistic that there is a way for this to happen. And the reason I'm optimistic is not because I think that the two principal participants are going to somehow wake up one morning and say, Eureka, we've got it. It's because of the passion with which I think the rest of the world watching this, especially the three main blocs that I talked about, have to feel towards the necessity of getting this done, not just for the two parties concerned. I mean, they benefit from it, but from the fact that it touches on so many other global issues that we think is extremely important. So it is hard. I think that the president showed great courage in taking this on from day one, as opposed to waiting a while. This gives him more time. Obviously, he's got 2 more years to go on this term, and so there is time. And it's not something that he's ducking away from. But we are trying. He is trying very, very hard, and the whole team is trying very, very hard to make sure that the right path is found. And it's a path that's as comprehensive as possible. But at the end of the day, I don't think you're going to see President Obama kind of say, you know what, this is too hard. I've got too many other things to do, so I'm going to.
Now that you're out of government, if there were some way of cutting the Gordian knot of sort of negotiating letters about settlements or whatever, is there some other approach, an international conference, an Arab, European, American? What would you do out of government now?
Well, there have been a lot of proposals. President Sarkozy has tried to put something together in Barcelona following the NATO summit. But ultimately, people around the world on this issue look to the United States. The Europeans do, the Arabs do, and ultimately there may be a day when this president will have to confront the hard choice and make the decision that, you know what, we might not get there using the tactics or the strategies that were ongoing, and we may have to shift to something else. That's something that I can't speculate on. It might come, it might not, but I think he wants to give it as much time as he can, as much energy as he can with his team to see if there's a way to get the two principal parties, for their own good, to do what needs to be done. But there are other options that certainly a president could consider.
Like what?
Well, like a more direct involvement in terms of bringing the outside world into with proposals that would have more of a forcing function on the two principles. In other words, instead of having them be the articulators, there is, because it's such a global issue and it's so important, that there might come a time when we would have to look at another option. But that's for the president to decide.
A global option. When you were envoy over there, worked closely with Tzipi Livni.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think she is a key to this and really wants to make a peace settlement?
I was very impressed with Foreign Minister Livni when she was in office, and I know Secretary Rice and Steve and their team, our team, because I was part of it, worked very, very well with her. And in my discussions with her since then, I think she's genuinely committed to finding the path to the two-state solution.
Do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is generally committed to that?
I think so. I think so. I think he's certainly represented that to the President of the United States, both publicly and privately.
Does he seem to say that here, but feel different there?
Well, it is, local politics make an impact on people, and we have to, look, what's going to be required here is for President Abbas and the Prime Minister to rise above politics and do what's right for the region, for their people. Both will benefit from this. And I think both, from my experience, both understand this. Both are struggling to find the right path to make this happen. And the President of the United States, leaders of Europe, leaders of the Arab world, are also weighing in to try to push these two towards doing the right thing. And there may come a time when they will have to, come to their own conclusions as to whether this is going to happen or not. But for now, I think we ought to let it play out.
Dr. Hadley?
I'll give a quick response to the questions. Judith is right. It's ironic that it is the creation of a Palestinian state that can legitimate Israel as a Jewish state in the Middle East. And we should be saying that over and over again to the Israelis. Why is it hard? Is because Israel is a democracy, and in some sense, Palestinians are building a democracy, and they've got to be willing to have a deal they can sell to their people and their people will go along with, and that is a difficult thing. When you do a negotiation, sometimes you start with the hardest issue, because if you can break it, everything else is easy, and sometimes you start with the easiest issue to build some progress. And David, that's, I think, why under a framework agreement, we still ought to try to do on borders and security. If we have to get agreement on the Israeli issue, on the Jerusalem issue up front, we're going nowhere. Third, agreeing to pull down settlements and pay to relocate settlers, we're going to be doing that big time, I'm sure, as part of the peace agreement. So that is clearly in everybody's future. 4, I've tried to be very positive in my statements about President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad and what they're doing in the West Bank, and I believe it. But I think we have to recognize there is a question out there. We've talked a lot about questions about Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's a question about whether any Palestinian leader can accept any concessions short of 100% of their declared position. Because a lot was offered to Arafat by President Clinton, a lot was offered to President Abbas by Prime Minister Olmert. And I think it's a question that is out there and is going to have to be decided. And lastly, it may be at some point, and if smart people, I would have some smart people think about this, it may be that the formality and the bright lights of the negotiation is itself the problem. It's just too hard to do it in a formal negotiation. And maybe what we need is a kind of relationship where the parties agree on sort of coordinated parallel steps that over time actually resolve issues and lead to peace. But sort of sitting down with the great formal peace negotiation may just be too hard. It's a wacky idea. Somebody smart needs to think through, but we may need to really start thinking out of the box if we can't make progress this go round.
Dr. Hadley, General Jones, General Scowcroft, the Faroukis, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, sir.